All right, let's attempt in the half an hour or so that we have to make as much progress on Jean-Paul Sartre as we can. All right, so I'm going to be somewhat rapid fire in this presentation, but I do want you to know what I'm saying to you. Don't confuse my sort of haste in moving through this with any implication that it's not important material. It's quite important, but I'm feeling the sense of thrownness as I see the end of the year coming and realize all the things that I have yet to teach you. And I'm beginning to feel the angst, the despair that I'm not going to get through it, you know. So, Jean-Paul Sartre, born 1905 in Paris, died 1980. He was a cousin to Albert Schweitzer. Anybody know who Albert Schweitzer was? Anybody know that name? I won't, just make a note of it. It's a name you'll run into. A little trivia, he was a cousin to Schweitzer. He was influenced as a teenager. Now, I want you to keep this in mind. He was influenced as a teenager by Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger. There's not many people in the world who can say, I was influenced as a teenager by Kant, Hegel. You, of course, can say that. But you are a rare species. But he read them and was influenced by them by actually reading them. He was a genius. In 1929, he became romantically tied to Simone de Beauvoir. Simone, S-I-M-O-N-E, de Beauvoir, B-E-A-U-V-O-I-R. They never married, but they had a lifelong romance. Oh, isn't that sweet? He was a student of Husserl and Heidegger both. He studied under both of these men. Husserl and Heidegger both had a huge influence on him, although he was not a follower of either of them. Got his Doctor of Philosophy when he was 24 years old, and following that he taught philosophy for many years. He fought for the French in the run-up to World War II. So when the Germans were invading in 1940, as you know, they entered, those of you remember 20th century history, they invaded France through Belgium, and Sartre was there on the front lines fighting, was captured. But for whatever reasons, I'm not sure how it happened, but he was released or escaped, one or the other, and wound up fighting for the French resistance during the entire French occupation. I have a picture of him here. I thought I did. No, I don't. Huh. Sorry, I got it. His most famous writings, these I do want you to know, have name recognition of these writings. One of his most famous, in fact his first published work, was entitled Intimacy. Intimacy. In this work, he describes in detail the function of the armpit in lovemaking. You did hear me right. Just write it down. You can reflect on this later. The function of the armpit in intimate lovemaking. It's quite insightful, but not recommended reading. Second well-known work, one of his best known, was simply entitled Nausea. Nausea. He wrote several plays. The most famous of them, I would say, is the play entitled No Exit. No Exit. If we had quite a bit more time, we'd read some of No Exit. The most famous line in No Exit is toward the end of the play, in which he simply says, the play has 3 players in it, and one of them says, I see, comma, hell is other people. Hell is other people. Another play that we will read some of next week as we have time. Time is slipping away from us rapidly, but we will read some of The Flies. He was, because of his brilliance as a literary figure, offered a Nobel Prize. I don't think it was a Peace Prize, it was a Nobel Prize for literature. He refused it, thumbed his nose at the institutions of respectability in this culture. Refused it with disdain, I might say. No Nobel Prizes for Sartre. All right, so that's kind of a sketch of his life. He was an interesting character. His metaphysics is captured in the phrase I gave you yesterday. He's the one that made this popular existence precedes essence. I'm not going to go back through that because you've mastered that idea from our conversation yesterday. But you may get a little flavor for his thought in his anti-theistic proof. He was an atheist. And his argument against the existence of God. By the way, this is interesting. You realize that, as a rule, in the history of philosophy and apologetics, you have arguments for the existence of God and criticisms of those arguments, right? You rarely run into an argument against the existence of God. I mean, you might get something like, oh, God can't be there because the world is filled with evil, arguments like that. But Sartre actually proposes an argument against the existence of God, which is very telling when it comes to understanding his philosophy. So I want to give this to you. You won't be persuaded by it, but it will give you some feel for his thought. His basic argument is simply this: if man exists, God cannot exist. Right? If there is man, God cannot be. His reasoning is this: man, by any definition, must be a subject. Remember, subjectivity. Man must be a subject. What he means by that is to be man, to be human, requires you have that aspect of your life that is private. It is your subjective possession. Nobody can intrude into it. It is yours and yours alone. There's parts of you, obviously, that are public. I stand here before you throwing my marker around. There's parts of my life that are public. I'm here, you can see me, something of, my name, my age, etc. Certain things I can't hide. But I'm saying to you right now, there is a part of my life that you don't see and you never will. It is private. It is mine alone. And every one of you in this room shares something of that private piece. Can I retrieve my marker? Thank you. And that's what he says is essential to humanity. Unless you have that, you are not human. And then he says, if God exists, you don't have that region of subjectivity because God sees it. And if God sees it, you are no longer a subject, you are only an object. And if you are only an object, then you are not man. So if man is, God cannot be. You follow that? Now, like I say, that's not intended to persuade you, but it does give you some idea of the flavor of his philosophy. He is horrified at the idea that there is what he calls this absolute voyeur. You know what a voyeur is, don't you? Voyeurism, do you know that term? That's somebody who likes to walk around the neighborhood at night and look in other people's windows, you know. You know what that is? You've heard of that? That's a voyeur. In case you've never heard of that term, you can add that to your list of obscure terms that you'll run into. It is a crime. You should not do it, you know. If you get caught, you will go to jail. Voyeurism is a crime. But it is also a description of a certain psychological malady that some people have. Some people do that. Hopefully none of you, you know. But what Sartre is saying is that God is the absolute voyeur. God is the one who is there invisibly, looking at you and seeing you right down to the very core of your most private thoughts, your most private motives. All of that is open and laid bare before the eyes of him with whom we have you do. Sartre knows that verse, and he hates it. And he says, if there is such a being in the universe, then there cannot be man in the same universe. Because man must have that private part that's untrammeled by a divine voyeur. Yeah.
He says that man can't be in the universe if God exists, then can anything be in the universe if God exists?
Yeah, because not everything else is subject. You see.
What about animals, though?
Animals, he's not concerned about. He would say the one thing that distinguishes humanity from the animals is that we have this subjectivity. He wouldn't allow that for an animal, to my knowledge. This is what distinguishes humanity. His play No Exit, I think, is a wonderful dramatic expression of this. And though we won't read it, if you ever have a chance to read it, you should. It's, you know, one of the things about Sartre that I think is worth noting is that unlike Heidegger, unlike Hegel, unlike Kant, unlike Comte, unlike a lot of the philosophers we've talked about, Sartre is not only a very competent philosopher, and he can do philosophy at a very philosophical and technical level, you know, but he's also a popularizer. He can write at a popular level. Nietzsche could do that. Kierkegaard could do that. Most philosophers can't. Most philosophers are deadly boring. You know, they are not enjoyable reading. Reading most philosophers is nothing but work. But some of these guys are able to move, you know, it's like they can do this philosophical work and prove they are philosophers. But they can also jump to a different level and write in a way that's consistent with their philosophy, but popularize it. And so the plays of Sartre were popularly accessible to people who would go and see them, and so on. And that's part of why existentialism got into the culture so rapidly. You know, it took Kant's philosophy 50 to 75 years to get to the bloodstream. You awake there? Yeah. I see the glazed eyes, you know.
Bloodstream.
Yeah, bloodstream, that's good. You know? Most philosophers, it takes them a long time for their philosophy to get into the bloodstream, there's the word, of the culture. Sartre and others like him were able to get past that much more rapidly because they were able to do their own popularizing, you know. And No Exit is one example of that. And the story of No Exit is simple enough. It involves three people. So I don't think I'll ever do this one, happily. But here's the basic storyline. You got three people, and all of them go to hell. So the entire story is set in hell. And these three people are put in a room, and they're all kind of surprised because there's no fire, there's no brimstone, there's no devils running around with pitchforks, there's no terror, there's none of the caricatures that he thinks people normally have about hell are present. And so at first they're sort of relieved. Well, I guess this won't be so bad after all, We're locked in this room, but hey, could have been a lot worse, sort of thing. And then as the play unfolds, you begin to get a feel for the dynamics of these three people. There are two women and one man. The man is sexually attracted to one of the women. He's drawn to her, he likes her. She, however, is a lesbian and is sexually attracted to the other woman, who is attracted to the man. Okay? You got it? And then the entire play is a very subtle sort of description of the interactions of these three as they gradually become more and more acutely aware of the frustrations of this eternal triad stuck in a room. And one of the little details of it...
You don't have Jonathan Potter, do you?
I do.
Thank you, sorry, Mr. Gore.
That's quite all right. One of the little subtleties, one of many, by the way, that shows up in the play is that people in hell have no eyelids. They cannot blink. Their eyes are always open. You getting a feel for it? Listen, everybody in the room is always, always under the gaze of everybody else in the room. How do you feel when somebody's gazing at you and they don't take their eyes off you, I mean, sometimes we don't mind. If I'm teaching a class, then in fact I rather like it if people are looking at me as opposed to extraneous things in the room, which is what I usually experience, but because that gives me some idea that people are paying attention. I know that's a lot to expect, but that's at least the thought. But if you're just sitting, at a Starbucks and you're having a cup of coffee with a friend and the two of you are interacting casually, and then you sort of feel the hair on the back of your neck beginning to prickle a little bit because just at the edge of your peripheral vision, you realize somebody over in the corner is staring at you. Never had that experience? You're used to it? I know. Famous people, it happens all the time. Paul Sartre would have that experience. He was a very famous guy in Paris. He was a hero of the after the war and so on, and his writings, etc. He was very well known. He was very widely respected, and he was a famous guy. And he liked to go down, grab the morning newspaper, sit out on the sidewalk at a cafe along the streets of Paris, but he hated the experience of realizing that somebody off a few feet away was, that's Jean-Paul Sartre over there. Look at and they'd kind of. He called that experience existential self-awareness. Existential self-awareness, that feeling, that uneasy feeling that comes over you when you are under the gaze of somebody else. We all know, we teach little children as they're growing up, don't stare. It's impolite, don't we? And we all have this consciousness of the effect of gazing at someone. You guys went to Europe last summer. You go into an art museum, You walk up to a piece of art, you stare at the piece of art, you may be a great art critic, you could stare there, stand there for 3 hours. What happens if you go over and stare at the guard for 3 hours? You're going to create some anxiety. Little children have a game they play sometimes. Probably some of you recall playing it, right? As children, called a stare down. You just stare at somebody, see who can do it for the longest. Stephen, you had a question
I
there.
was just wondering, how did Sartre describe the room that they were locked in?
It was a nice room, well furnished. There was good food to eat. It was not an uncomfortable room. There's no sleeping. You see, you're eternally locked in this triad. That's how he's trying to illustrate it. That's why he finally reaches the conclusion at the end of No Exit. This final concluding remark is what? Hell is other people. Well, he believes that's true not only in hell, he believes that's true on earth. That's the solitude of existentialism. Existentialism finally leaves you alone and trying to defend yourself against the intrusions of other people. Yeah.
So Sartre doesn't believe in God, so he doesn't believe in a heaven. So then why does he?
Oh, don't push the point too far. This is myth. He's writing this as a piece of literature to illustrate his philosophical point. But yeah, he doesn't believe in hell. He doesn't actually believe any of this would ever happen. But his whole point here is to try to show in some ways, Alicia, that we are all in hell right now, according to Sartre. We're already there. We're already locked in these inescapable relationships that violate us, Just a couple of things in Sartre that are a little bit more... Was that a question, Jake? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this kind of relates to the no exit thing and also to his anti-theistic proof. That How does he substantiate the idea that man has to be a subject?
He just says it. He just says it.
Because it seems like I've heard, at least nowadays, a lot of times this kind of, I guess what he calls existential self-awareness being an evidence kind of for the existence of God.
Yeah, and that's why I say you wouldn't be persuaded by Sartre's argument, nor does he expect you to be persuaded in the ordinary sense of the application of logic and reason and so on. He's an existentialist, and they don't feel very bound to reason. It's reason is of rather limited importance to a true existentialist. But what he is appealing to is his own sense of his own humanity. And I think what you really hear in Sartre is his great anger. He is an angry man. And, it's like the classical atheistic complaint. God doesn't exist and I hate him. That's really the flavor you get with Sartre. God doesn't exist and boy, do I hate him. That really comes through. And I think, Jacob, you're a lot closer to the heart of Sartre if you think about it that way. He's not giving you a geometric proof that's going to lead you syllogistically to this conclusion. It's more of a philosophical kind of literary thing. Avery.
Why is he an angry man if usually you think of angry people as people that are less social and can't really, you said he's one of the few philosophers that can really connect with the general public.
Yeah.
How does that?
Yeah. He connects with the general public, but I don't think he likes them much. His plays that he writes them not because he's, at least by all external appearances, not because he's interested in public acclaim or fame or popularity or such thing. He's a man who's wrapped up in giving expression to his own sort of frustrations about things, but he does it in all these various ways. He's a very complicated guy, very complicated. He's worth studying, but don't expect to be uplifted by a study of Sartre. He's a sad case, he really is, a sad genius, you know, you can say. Just a couple of things that, as I say, are a little bit more technical, but may be worth knowing, just because you may come across this guy again. He makes a distinction. This is more of his, kind of the technical ideas that he works out. But he distinguishes between a thing for itself and a thing in itself. A thing in itself is an inert thing. This is something that is not really aware even of its own existence. An animal, I think, would fit in this category as well, whereas a thing for itself is this thing that has some sense of its own subject. So that is distinctively human. That's the way he kind of distinguishes that. So he starts with this idea of a thing for itself, being aware of itself as a self. I'm aware that I'm here, and I'm aware that I'm here in a way that is distinguished from the things around me. I'm conscious of being conscious of my surroundings. I'm also conscious of being conscious. I'm aware of myself perceiving these things. And it's that idea of the self that's hanging there in the middle that is really kind of at the heart of it. Now this gives rise then to his whole notion of alienation. I'm aware of myself as a self, and I'm also aware that I'm alienated. From the things around me. So I'm here as a self, observing, for example, a tree, and in a sense, the tree, which is a thing in itself, is what it is. But I, by virtue of my perception of the tree, have been slightly changed by it. And so I'm never quite what I just was. I'm always in a state of this ongoing, like a river flowing. This is the very, sort of the Heraclitus aspect. Everything that happens to me is affecting me, changing me, shaping me. And so the alienation I have is precisely because, though I'm surrounded by things that are basically static, I'm always dynamic. I'm always becoming something slightly different. That's why my existence must precede my essence, because there is no essence to me. To put an essence on me would be to make me static. I am a man. I am this, I am that. But I'm not, because I just became something different. I just changed ever so slightly. And so I'm always the cutting edge of my own changing definition of what I am. Can I do this? Let me try. I may not get through this, but so I feel this anxiety. I feel this tension between my ever-changing, dynamically altering self and the things around me. I feel this, and I am driven thereby to some sort of effort to overcome the problem. And there's basically two ways to overcome it, according to Sartre. One is to try to marry the things around me to me and say they are all part of me. This is what phenomenology does. This is what Husserl did. This is called solipsism. You ever heard that expression, solipsism? Is that a new term? Just tuck it away. Solipsism is a philosophical idea that really all there is me. You guys are all just a little fig Newton of me. I'm all there really is. What if there really isn't a universe? What if there really is? What if all there are just my feelings, my sensations, the phenomena of these things, and really all I'm it? There's a scary thought. That's solipsism. And Sartre doesn't like that. He doesn't think that is satisfying view. The other is for me to lose myself in the world, kind of like Eastern religion does, where everything doesn't become part of me, but I just sort of drift out and become part of everything else. You know, Hinduism. That doesn't work either. And so Sartre basically despairs. There is no answer to this problem. The synthesis is impossible, and therefore human life ultimately is basically meaningless. So the meaning of your life is that there is no meaning. Have a lovely weekend.